Hi guys, Dr. Mitchell again. This time we'll be talking about creating and storing objects, also known as instantiation. So in this video we're going to focus on those constructors that we used before to talk about how we can use those to create objects and initialize those the values for those attributes. So ultimately, by the end of this, what you're going to learn is, first of all, how to figure out which constructor is being called. An object can have multiple constructors, so we're going to differentiate between those. We'll also learn how what the signature looks like, what part of that signature contains the parameter list, and the difference between formal parameters and actual parameters, and how they're passed to the constructor. So let's start by looking at an example. So when we create objects, we use constructors to initialize the values for the attributes that we've decided this object is going to have. So we've seen examples of this so far. For example, with my person object, my constructor was public person, and then I had a list of parameters within those parentheses. The constructor is always going to start with public, and it's going to have the same name as the class. So what's highlighted in red right now is referred to as the signature. The signature contains the name of the constructor and the parameter list that will be used to initialize those values. The formal parameters are the actual the information that's being passed to the constructor that's contained within those parentheses. So in this case, I have that I'm passing a string, an integer, and a Boolean that I'm going to set equal to or store into the instance variables that I've defined for my person object. When I go to actually create my object, the values that I'm passing in my call to that constructor is referred to by call by value. So when I'm passing the values Bryce, 17, and false to the constructor, it's actually sending copies of those values to the constructor so that they can get stored into the instance variables. We've seen before with my dog example earlier that we can create an object using the new keyword followed by the class name. So in my previous example, I had Grace dog, but the key here is the fact that I set it equal to, when I created dog Grace dog, I set that equal to a new dog, meaning I'm creating a new object with these values for my attributes. So that new keyword is essential in actually creating the object. And then these values here that I have defined or that I'm going to initialize those attributes with in my constructor, these are the actual parameters that will then be passed to the formal parameters in the constructor. So ultimately, this line of code will create the new object and call the constructor. You can have more than one constructor for an object, and doing so is called overloading the constructor. I might do that because I might have multiple ways to actually create the object. So I might have different constructors to handle the different ways I can actually create my object. And then there's also the no argument constructor or default constructor that has no parameters and will set the instance variables for that object to whatever the default values are for that particular data type. So let's look at some examples and kind of practice how we do this. So looking at a new example, I want to create a car object for a program. So I might have some attributes like the make of the car, whether or not it's a sports car, so I'll use is sports to represent that, and who the owner of that car is. So when I go to create my constructor for that car, here I have a default or no argument constructor which takes no parameters, so it's just going to set the values of those instance variables to their default values. So since make is a string, the default value for a string is null. So my boring car that I'm going to construct here is just going to have a null value for make. The default value for a sports or for a Boolean is false. And the owner, since it's a string, is set to null as well. Now, of course, with it being a default constructor, I could establish some actual default values, but this is just to also just reiterate that it does typically create or set it equal to those default values. So this is why it's a boring car, because nobody owns a car, it doesn't have a make, and it's not even a sports car. Kind of boring. But maybe I want to make a fast car. So I'm going to use my constructor. I'm going to make a different constructor so that way I can create a fast car object. So when I call the constructor using the new keyword to create fast car, I would probably pass the values Ferrari for the make, is sports, I'll pass to true because of course Ferraris are sports cars, and then I'll pass the value of Mitchell to the owner, so that way I can use those values and pass them to my formal parameters in the constructor. And then I have a third constructor that only has 2 parameters. Even though I have 3 instance variables, I don't have to always use all of the parameters in my signature for my constructor. So in this case, I have just 2 of those parameters that I'm going to initialize, and then the third one I'm going to set to null because this car is for sale. So since it's a car for sale object, I'm going to set the make to Ford. I'm going to set is sports to false, and then the owner will be null because nobody owns it right now. It's for sale. So when I look at having these different constructors, I also have to make sure I pay attention to which constructor is being called when they're all in one program together. So for example, if I have car, my car equals new car, and I'm passing Dodge, True, and Susan, that is going to call this first constructor because the types and the number of parameters matches that constructor. So the compiler will use that constructor to initialize those values. If I try creating a new car called my car and I only call it, try to create that object with the values of Honda and false, Java will match those data types and the number of parameters to the second constructor that I have here because the first one is a string, the second one is a Boolean, and there's only 2 parameters being passed, and it will initialize those instance variables accordingly. So what should we take away? So we know that our signature not only defines how we're going to create that object, but also helps the compiler to determine which signature I'm using when I'm creating objects and there's multiple constructors available. That parameter list is helpful in making sure that we're passing the right values as well. We know that formal parameters are what's actually defined in the signature, and the actual parameters are the actual values that I'm calling the constructor with when I go to create my object. Constructors are overloaded when I have multiple constructors. So thanks. See you guys again soon.